Prepare yourself. For the next hour, you'll descend into anxiety, terror, and pure, unrelenting horror. In this story, you'll witness a team of explorers seeking answers, an abandoned island that hides centuries-old secrets, a discovery that should never have been made, a forest that breathes, watches, and waits, a force beyond comprehension, beyond escape. Will anyone survive, or will they all be devoured by the thing beneath? Enjoy the terror. Narrated exclusively for the Void Channel. The sea was unnaturally calm, like glass, stretching endlessly under a leaden sky. The expedition boat cut through the water with mechanical precision, but even the low hum of the engine felt muffled, as if the air itself was swallowing the sound. Dr. Elias Hargrove, leader of the group, leaned against the side, scanning the distant silhouette of the island that had consumed his thoughts for months. From this distance, it looked almost serene, a crescent of rocky cliffs and dense emerald green foliage rising from the ocean like the back of some slumbering beast. The crew was silent. Even before they set off, the locals in the nearest harbor town refused to talk about the island, as if naming it alone would summon something unspeakable. The most they got was a muttered warning from an old fisherman with wild eyes and trembling hands. You'll hear them, the voices. You think they're just the wind. You'll think it's in your head, but they're not. They're real. They're waiting for you. Hargrove replayed the man's words in his mind as he gripped the edge of the boat. Beside him, Sarah Montague, the team's sound engineer, checked her recording equipment for the 10th time. Her hands shook slightly, but her jaw was set in that determined way Hargrove admired. She was the first to agree to the trip, despite the strange accounts that had trickled in about the island. It's probably some natural acoustic phenomenon, she had said back in the safety of their university office. Unexplained, sure, but not supernatural. Now, with the island looming closer, she wasn't saying much. Behind them, Grant, the group's navigator, fiddled nervously with the boat's GPS. The device had been malfunctioning ever since they came within 10 miles of the island. The signal would vanish, the map would glitch, and occasionally the screen would display nonsensical coordinates, as if the island didn't want to be found. It's just interference, Grant muttered, though no one had asked. His voice was tight, brittle, and his eyes darted to the horizon like he expected it to swallow them whole. The only one who seemed unaffected was Cassidy, the team's photographer. She sat at the bow of the boat, camera in hand, her expression unreadable. Every few minutes she snapped a photo of the island or the gray expanse of ocean, as if she were documenting something no one else could see. The air grew heavier as they approached, thick with a strange tension that none of them could name. The boat's engine sputtered briefly, a sound that made everyone's head snap up. Hargrove felt a chill creep down his spine. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper. "No," Grant replied too quickly, but Hargrove had heard it. A faint sound carried on the breeze. It wasn't the engine. It wasn't the water. It was something else, something distant, almost imperceptible, like the echo of a whisper just beyond the range of hearing. It was a voice. By the time they reached the island, the sun was obscured behind a thick veil of clouds. The cliffs rose like jagged teeth, and the air here was different, colder, despite the warm season. Hargrove stepped onto the black, pebbled shore, his boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. The others followed, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were intruding on a place that didn't want them. The village wasn't far. It sat nestled in a shallow valley, barely visible from the beach. As they moved closer, the sense of unease grew stronger. The path was overgrown, lined with twisted trees whose branches seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. The air carried an odd metallic tang, like the smell of blood before a storm. And then they saw it. The village was small, no more than a dozen wooden houses clustered together, their roofs sagging under years of neglect. Doors hung ajar, swinging gently in the windless air. Hargrove felt his breath catch. There was something profoundly wrong about the place, though he couldn't put it into words. "It's empty," Sarah murmured, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "No," Cassidy said, raising her camera. "It's abandoned. There's a difference." They entered the first house cautiously. Inside, it was as if time had frozen. A table was set with plates and silverware, though the food had long since decayed into unrecognizable sludge. A pair of shoes sat neatly by the door. On the wall, a faded photograph of a family. A man, a woman, 2 children, stared back at them. "Looks like they left in a hurry," Grant said, his voice barely audible. Hargrove nodded, though his eyes were fixed on the photograph. The longer he looked at it, the more something felt off. The faces in the photo seemed distorted, their features slightly blurred, like a poorly developed image. And yet, the longer he stared, the more he thought he could see their eyes moving. The sound came again, a faint whisper, almost like a sigh, threading through the air. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice sharper this time. "Yes," Hargrove said. They moved to the next house, then the next. Each one was the same, abandoned but not empty. It was as if the village had been left in the middle of an ordinary day. Meals half-eaten, chairs pulled back from tables, tools lying forgotten on the ground. But the whispering grew louder. By the time they reached the village square, it was impossible to ignore. The sound didn't come from any one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding them, pressing in. Hargrove could feel it vibrating in his chest, a low, insistent hum that wasn't quite words, but wasn't just noise either. In the center of the square stood a weathered statue, its features eroded beyond recognition. Beneath it, a plaque bore an inscription in a language none of them recognized. Sarah knelt to take a closer look, her brow furrowing. "It's not Latin or Greek. I've never seen anything like this before." Cassidy raised her camera to take a picture, but as soon as she did, the whispering surged into a roar. It was a voice now, unmistakable, deep and resonant, cutting through the air like a blade. "Leave." For a moment, none of them moved. The word hung in the air, impossibly loud, reverberating in their skulls. Then the wind picked up. It came from nowhere, sudden and violent, swirling through the square with a force that nearly knocked them off their feet. Hargrove grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back as debris flew past them. The whispering voices rose to a cacophony, overlapping, speaking in languages none of them could understand. And through it all, Hargrove thought he saw something moving at the edge of his vision. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the far end of the square. Its features were indistinct, shrouded in the shifting air, but its eyes burned like pale blue fire. When he blinked, it was gone. "Back to the boat," he said, his voice trembling. But the wind had other plans. The wind didn't stop, It howled through the trees like a living thing, clawing at their faces, hurling sand and debris into the air. The whispering hadn't gone. It had changed. It was no longer faint or disjointed. It was purposeful, rhythmic, a language just beyond comprehension, rising and falling like a twisted chant. Hargrove led the group, his voice sharp and clipped as he shouted over the storm, "Move! Back to the boat now!" But the path they had taken from the beach wasn't there anymore. The overgrown trail seemed to twist in on itself, the trees crowding closer together, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. It was as if the island itself had shifted, reshaped by some unseen force. Grant stumbled, swearing under his breath as his GPS fell from his hands and shattered against a rock. He froze, staring at the broken device, and then looked up, his face pale. "It's not letting us leave," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Hargrove grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. "Don't stop. Keep moving." The village disappeared behind them, swallowed by the dense forest. But the voices followed. They came upon the first sign of something worse when Sarah screamed. It was a high, piercing sound that cut through the storm like a razor. Hargrove spun around to see her standing rigid, her hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking. "What is it?" he shouted, running to her side. She pointed, trembling. There, half hidden in the undergrowth, was a body, or at least what was left of one. The figure was contorted, its limbs bent at impossible angles, as though it had been dropped from a great height. Its skin was stretched taut over its bones, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. Cassidy knelt beside it, her camera forgotten at her side. She reached out, hesitating, before brushing the dirt from the body's face. "It's fresh," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's impossible," Hargrove said. "This place has been abandoned for decades." But the evidence was right there. The body wasn't skeletal or decayed. The skin was intact, though deathly pale, and the eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the canopy above. And then the whispering shifted again. The voices became louder, closer, surrounding them. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was inside their heads. Hargrove felt it like fingers clawing at the edges of his mind, digging into his thoughts, pulling at memories he didn't want to relive. "Do you hear it?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes," Cassidy replied, but she wasn't looking at Sarah. She was staring at the body, her eyes wide and unfocused. "It's saying something." "Stop listening," Hargrove snapped, grabbing her by the shoulder. But it was too late. Cassidy's breathing grew shallow, her body swaying slightly as if caught in a trance. "It knows us," she murmured. "It knows who we are." They moved on, though every step felt heavier, the forest pressing closer around them. The trees seemed alive, their twisted trunks and blackened roots writhing in the corner of Hargrove's vision. No one spoke. Even the sound of their own breathing seemed to trigger the voices, which grew louder and more insistent with every passing moment. It wasn't long before they found the ruins. They emerged into a clearing, the ground littered with shattered stones and the remains of ancient structures. The air here was colder, biting against their skin, and the metallic tang that had lingered in the village was overpowering now, stinging their noses and throats. At the center of the clearing was a pit. It was wide and circular, its edges lined with crumbling stone etched with the same alien symbols they had seen on the statue. The pit seemed impossibly deep, the darkness inside it swallowing the light. "What the hell is this?" Grant muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "A well," Sarah said, though the word felt inadequate. "But what kind of well looks like this?" Cassidy was the first to approach. She moved slowly, her camera clutched tightly in her hands, her eyes fixed on the pit. "Cassidy, don't..." Hargrove started, but she didn't stop. She knelt at the edge, peering into the darkness. The whispering voices surged, louder than ever, and Hargrove felt his knees buckle. Cassidy's breath hitched. "It's moving," she said. "What's moving?" Hargrove demanded, pulling himself upright. She didn't respond. Her hands trembled as she raised her camera, snapping a photo. The flash illuminated the pit for a split second, and what Hargrove saw made his stomach lurch. Something was inside. It wasn't clear, not fully visible, but the darkness shifted as if it were alive, writhing and pulsing like some vast liquid organism. And then, for just a moment, Hargrove saw eyes, hundreds of them, glowing faintly in the blackness, staring up at them with a hunger that made his skin crawl. Cassidy stumbled back, her face pale. "It's looking at us," she whispered. "No," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "It's looking through us." The voices were deafening now. They weren't whispers anymore. They were screams, raw and primal, tearing through the air and the minds of everyone present. Hargrove dropped to his knees, clutching his head, trying to block them out, but it was useless. He heard his own voice among them, distorted and warped, screaming things he had never said. He heard Sarah's voice, Cassidy's, Grant's, all of them screaming together in a cacophony of terror. And then the wind came again. It rose from the pit, a torrent of freezing air that carried with it the stench of rot and decay. It whipped through the clearing, tearing at their clothes and skin, forcing them to stagger back. From the corner of his eye, Hargrove saw Grant fall to the ground, his mouth open in a silent scream, his body convulsed, his limbs twisting at unnatural angles, and then he went still. Hargrove tried to move to reach him, but the wind pinned him in place. The voices grew louder, merging into one single horrific sound, and then it spoke. "You are not welcome here." The words were thunderous, vibrating through the air and the ground, shaking the ruins and the trees. Hargrove felt his body go numb, his vision blurring. In the pit, the darkness began to rise. The darkness rose like smoke, twisting and shifting as if alive, spilling out of the pit in slow, deliberate waves. It moved unnaturally, defying gravity, its tendrils coiling in the air like serpents tasting the fear that radiated from the group. The whispering voices had stopped. What replaced them was worse. Silence so complete, so absolute, it pressed against their eardrums like a physical weight. Hargrove tried to speak, to shout for Sarah or Cassidy, but his voice felt trapped in his throat, locked there by the oppressive stillness. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight as though the air itself had turned poisonous. The pit was alive. There was no other way to describe it. The writhing mass of shadows seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own, its surface shimmering with faint shifting patterns. Not light, but something older and darker, like the remnants of a language that predated humanity itself. Cassidy was the first to break the stillness. She stepped forward, her movements slow and jerky, as if she were a puppet on invisible strings. Her camera dangled from her hand, forgotten. Her eyes were fixed on the pit, wide and unblinking. "Cassidy," Hargrove croaked, his voice raw. "Stop." But she didn't stop. She fell to her knees at the edge of the pit, her body trembling violently. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Hargrove staggered toward her, but the shadows surged upward, a sudden wave of darkness that sent him sprawling to the ground. Then Cassidy began to scream. It was a sound unlike anything Hargrove had ever heard, high and shrill, but layered with something deeper, something inhuman. Her hands clawed at her face, her nails drawing long, jagged lines of blood across her cheeks. "It's inside me!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Oh God, it's in my head!" The shadows enveloped her before anyone could move. They surged around her, swallowing her whole, and for a moment the clearing was plunged into total darkness. When the shadows receded, she was gone. The silence returned, heavier than before. Hargrove struggled to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. Sarah was crouched nearby, her face buried in her hands, her body racked with silent sobs. Grant. Hargrove looked toward Grant and felt bile rise in his throat. Grant's body was still lying where it had fallen, but something was wrong. His limbs were twisted even further now, his joints bent backward as if some great force had tried to fold him into himself. His face was frozen in a grotesque rictus of pain, his mouth stretched impossibly wide, and his eyes were gone. Hargrove stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "It won't let us leave," she said. "You heard it. It told us." "I don't care," Hargrove snapped, his fear spilling over into anger. "We're not just going to sit here and die." But even as he said it, he knew the island wouldn't let them go. They ran, though there was no clear direction. The trees seemed to shift and twist around them, the path ahead narrowing until it felt like they were moving through a tunnel. The air grew colder with every step, their breaths visible in the dim light. The forest wasn't empty anymore. Shapes moved in the shadows, barely visible but always there, watching. They weren't human, though Hargrove's mind refused to fully process what they were. He caught glimpses of limbs too long and thin, faces with too many eyes, mouths that didn't close. They stayed at the edges of his vision, flickering in and out of existence like a nightmare half-remembered. And the sound returned. It started as a low hum, like the vibration of distant machinery, but it grew louder and more distinct with every passing second. It wasn't a hum, it was breathing, deep, slow and heavy, as if the entire island were alive and watching them with a malevolent hunger. Sarah fell behind, tripping over an exposed root. Hargrove turned back to help her, but as he reached for her arm, she froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Hargrove shook his head. "We don't have time." "Listen," she snapped, her voice sharp and panicked. He stopped. The breathing was gone now, replaced by a faint rhythmic sound. A song. It was soft, almost soothing, carried on the wind like a lullaby. But there was something wrong with it, something off about the melody. It didn't belong here, didn't belong anywhere. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, her voice dreamy. Hargrove grabbed her shoulders and shook her. "Don't listen to it. It's not real." But it was too late. Her eyes glazed over, and she began to hum along with the melody, her voice eerily in sync with the unseen singer. She smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched too far across her face, and then she began to walk. "No," Hargrove said, his voice cracking. "No, Sarah, stop." She didn't stop. She walked deeper into the forest, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she were being led by invisible hands. The shadows thickened around her, swallowing her figure until she disappeared entirely. Hargrove was alone. He stumbled forward, his mind racing. His thoughts were disjointed, fragmented, like shattered glass. He couldn't tell how much time had passed or if he was even moving in the right direction. The trees gave way to another clearing, and he stopped dead in his tracks. It was the pit again. No matter how far he ran, he always ended up back here. The shadows writhed and pulsed, rising higher now, forming vague, grotesque shapes that towered over him. He felt his knees buckle, his body collapsing to the ground. The voices returned, louder than ever. "You were never meant to come here." Hargrove screamed, clutching his head as the words tore through his mind like claws. He felt them prying into his thoughts, dragging his deepest fears and memories to the surface. "You cannot leave." The shadows surged toward him, enveloping him in cold, suffocating darkness. He tried to move, to fight, but his body refused to obey. And then he saw it. In the heart of the pit, something stirred. It was vast and incomprehensible, its form shifting and changing with every passing second. Eyes opened across its surface, hundreds of them, all staring at him. Mouths formed and unformed, whispering in a language he couldn't understand but somehow knew was meant for him. It wasn't just a creature, it was the island. It was the whispers, the voices, the wind, everything, and it had been waiting for him. Hargrove lay on the cold, unyielding ground, unable to move, unable to breathe. The pit loomed before him, its towering shadows reaching higher now, writhing and pulsating with grotesque shapes that defied logic. The entity, the island, had revealed itself in full, a vast and incomprehensible amalgamation of darkness, eyes and mouths, shifting and reforming endlessly. The voices weren't just outside of him anymore. They were inside him, clawing at his mind, twisting his memories, turning him against himself. "You were never meant to come here," the voice said again, though now it was clearer, more distinct. It wasn't one voice, but many, layered over one another, male and female, young and old, human and something else. Hargrove struggled to speak, to push back against the overwhelming presence invading his thoughts. His lips barely moved, his voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. "What do you want?" The shadows shifted, coalescing into a single towering form. It loomed over him, an impossibly tall figure with countless arms that stretched and twisted like branches. Its face, if it could be called that, was featureless save for a single massive eye, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The ground beneath Hargrove trembled as the voice spoke again. "You trespass on sacred ground. You woke what should have remained asleep." Memories flooded back, unbidden and uncontrollable. Hargrove saw the village again, its abandoned streets and decaying houses. He saw the statue with its grotesque, inhuman features, and then he saw the pit, not as it was now, but as it had been centuries ago, surrounded by people. They were chanting, their voices rising in unison, their faces contorted with a mix of ecstasy and terror. They weren't worshiping, they were pleading. He saw them toss offerings into the pit, gold, jewels, food, but the pit rejected them. The shadows surged upward, consuming the offerings before spilling out into the crowd. The people screamed as the darkness enveloped them, tearing them apart piece by piece, their cries echoing through the forest. And then he saw it, the entity, the thing that lived beneath the island. It had always been there, slumbering in the depths, waiting for something to wake it. The villagers had discovered it by accident, and in their desperation to appease it, they had only made it stronger. Hargrove's vision shifted again, this time to his own group. He saw their arrival on the island, their footsteps stirring the ancient earth, their voices breaking the unnatural silence. He saw Cassidy taking pictures of the statue, her camera's flash illuminating symbols that hadn't been seen in centuries. He saw Sarah walking through the village, her voice echoing in the stillness, carrying with it the vibrations that woke the sleeping god. And then he saw himself, standing at the edge of the pit, his presence the final insult to an ancient, vengeful force. "You have brought this upon yourselves," the voice said, its tone devoid of emotion. "Now you will pay the price." The ground beneath him began to crack, long fissures spreading outward from the pit like spiderwebs. The trees surrounding the clearing twisted and bent, their branches snapping like bones, their roots tearing free from the soil. Hargrove forced himself to his feet, his body trembling, his mind reeling. The shadows surged toward him, but he stumbled back, narrowly avoiding their grasp. "Why?" he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "Why are you doing this?" The entity didn't answer immediately. When it finally spoke, its voice was quieter, almost contemplative. "You ask the wrong question, human. Not why, but how long will you endure?" Hargrove's heart pounded in his chest. The shadows were closing in, and he knew he couldn't run. But he couldn't just give up either. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to stop this. His eyes darted around the clearing, searching for anything he could use. That's when he noticed the symbols. They were etched into the stones surrounding the pit, glowing faintly in the darkness. They were the same symbols he had seen on the statue in the village, the same symbols that had been carved into the walls of the houses. And suddenly, he understood. The symbols weren't just decorations. They were wards, ancient protections meant to keep the entity contained. The villagers hadn't been trying to worship it. They had been trying to imprison it. But the wards were broken now, worn away by time and neglect. The entity had been weak when they first arrived, but their presence, their curiosity, had given it strength. Hargrove moved toward the nearest stone, his hands shaking as he traced the symbols with his fingers. He didn't know what they meant, but he could feel their power, faint but still there, lingering beneath the surface. The shadows surged toward him, but he didn't stop. He grabbed a jagged rock from the ground and began carving into the stone, his hands moving instinctively, guided by some deep, primal understanding. The entity roared, its voice shaking the ground. The shadows lashed out, striking Hargrove across the back and sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through him, but he forced himself to his feet, blood dripping from the gash across his shoulders. He kept carving. The symbols began to glow brighter, their light cutting through the darkness. The entity screamed, its towering form writhing and contorting as the pit began to collapse in on itself. Hargrove didn't stop. He moved from stone to stone, carving and tracing, his hands slick with blood and sweat. The air grew colder, the shadows more violent, but he pressed on, driven by a single desperate thought. I have to finish. I have to stop it. The final stone was the hardest. The shadows wrapped around his legs, pulling him toward the pit, but he gritted his teeth and clawed his way forward. He carved the last symbol, his movements frantic, the rock in his hand splintering under the force of his grip. When the symbol was complete, the light exploded outward. The shadows screamed, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The ground shook violently, the pit collapsing in on itself. The towering form of the entity shrinking and fading into the darkness. Hargrove collapsed to the ground, his body broken, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was the pit, now sealed, the symbols glowing faintly in the dim light of dawn. Hargrove woke to silence, not the oppressive silence that had suffocated him before, but an empty, hollow stillness, like the island itself had gone dormant. His body ached in places he didn't know could hurt, his muscles screaming as he pushed himself upright. The dawn was weak and gray, the sky above clouded and cold. The pit was gone. Where it had been was now a smooth expanse of earth, its surface marred only by the faint glow of the symbols he had carved. The air was heavy, thick with the lingering smell of ash and iron. He tried to stand but fell to his knees, his legs trembling beneath him. He was alive, but only just. Sarah and Cassidy were gone. Grant too. He should have felt relief at surviving, but instead, an overwhelming wave of grief swept over him. He had come here with his friends, people he had laughed with, argued with, lived with, and now they were nothing but ghosts, their final moments etched into his memory like scars. Hargrove forced himself to his feet. He didn't look back at the pit as he stumbled toward the trees. His only thought now was escape. But the island wasn't done with him. As he made his way through the forest, the trees seemed taller, their branches thicker, their roots more tangled. The path he thought he had found twisted and shifted, leading him in circles. The forest was quieter now, but not empty. Something was watching him. He could feel it, a heavy presence that pressed against his mind, just on the edge of perception. He caught glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, flickers of black, shadows shifting unnaturally. His breathing quickened, his steps becoming more frantic. He tried not to look too long at the forest around him, but the landscape itself seemed to twist and distort as he moved. The trees were wrong. Their bark was etched with symbols he didn't recognize, symbols that pulsed faintly, like veins beneath skin. The ground beneath his feet was soft, too soft, as though the earth itself was alive and breathing. And then he heard it. A low, rhythmic sound, faint at first but growing louder with every step. It wasn't a voice, but it wasn't just noise either. It was a vibration, deep and primal, resonating in his chest. It was the same sound he had heard before, the breathing. Hargrove broke into a run. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay here. His surroundings blurred, the forest closing in around him, the trees reaching for him with gnarled skeletal branches. He burst into a clearing and stopped dead in his tracks. It was the village, or what was left of it. The houses had collapsed in on themselves, their walls and roofs warped and twisted, their windows shattered. The statue in the center was broken, its inhuman features cracked and crumbling. But the worst part was the ground. It was moving. The earth beneath the village writhed and pulsed, as though something massive was shifting just beneath the surface. Black veins spread out from the center, creeping toward the edges of the clearing like cracks in glass. And then he saw them. The villagers. They weren't alive, but they weren't dead either. Their forms were pale and translucent, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and agony. They moved slowly, their bodies flickering like dying flames, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. They were trapped. Hargrove stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The air around him grew colder, his breath visible in the dim light. The villagers turned toward him, their hollow eyes locking onto him, their movements becoming faster, more frantic. They were reaching for him. The ground beneath Hargrove's feet began to crack, and he realized too late that the pit wasn't gone. It had simply moved. The earth split open and he fell, tumbling into darkness. He clawed at the edges, dirt and rocks slipping through his fingers, his scream swallowed by the void. When he finally stopped falling, he found himself in a cavern, its walls slick with some dark, oily substance that reflected faint, shifting light. The air was heavy, suffocating, filled with the stench of decay. And in the center of the cavern was it, the entity. It was smaller now, confined to the space, but no less terrifying. Its form was more distinct, though still incomprehensible. A mass of shifting shapes and writhing tendrils, its surface covered in eyes that blinked in unison, mouths that whispered in languages Hargrove couldn't understand. "You cannot leave," it said, its voice echoing in his mind. "You sealed the surface, but you did not seal me." Hargrove staggered backward, his mind racing. He had stopped it from spreading, but he hadn't destroyed it. He hadn't even weakened it. "You are mine now," the entity said. "You will stay here, and you will feed me." The shadows surged toward him, wrapping around his legs, his arms, pulling him closer. He fought, clawing and kicking, but it was no use. The entity's tendrils wrapped around his throat, lifting him off the ground. He couldn't breathe. And then something strange happened. The symbols, the ones he had carved, began to glow again, not just in the cavern, but in his mind. He could see them, feel them, as though they were etched into his very soul. The entity recoiled, its form writhing in pain. "What is this?" it roared, its voice filled with rage. Hargrove didn't understand it himself, but he felt the power coursing through him. The symbols burned brighter, their light piercing through the darkness, driving the shadows back. The entity screamed, its form disintegrating, collapsing in on itself. Hargrove didn't wait to see what would happen next. He ran, the cavern shaking around him, the walls crumbling, the ground splitting apart beneath his feet. He didn't know where he was going, but he didn't care. He just ran. When he finally emerged from the cavern, he found himself back in the forest. The sky above was clear now, the sun shining down through the trees. The island was silent. Hargrove collapsed to the ground, his body shaking, his mind reeling. He had survived, but at what cost? The entity was gone, or at least trapped, but the island was forever changed, and so was he. As he made his way to the shore, to the boat they had arrived in, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows didn't move, but they felt alive, as though the island itself was still aware of him, still waiting. When he finally reached the boat, he hesitated. Something deep inside him told him not to leave, not to bring whatever had happened here back to the mainland. But he ignored it. He started the engine, the sound breaking the silence, and set off toward the horizon. He didn't notice the faint black veins spreading across the deck of the boat. He didn't notice the whispers that followed him, carried on the wind. And he didn't notice the faint glow of the symbols that now pulsed beneath his skin, a mark left by the entity. Hargrove was free. But the thing beneath the island wasn't finished. It was patient, and it was hungry.